on, Jimmy. Who are you going to fight against when this balloon of yours goes up?
Forces of anarchy, wreckers of law and order.
See?
Communists, Maoists, Trotskyists, Neo-Trotskyists, Crypto-Trotskyists, union leaders, communist union leaders.
See?
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Hi David, thanks for being with us today. So you're here to chat with us about forensic linguistics. Now I'm going to start with a quote from Shakespeare, if that's all right.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm springing this on you. Yeah. In Henry II, I guess Henry the King says, "Who shall rid me of this turbulent priest?" Right?
Okay.
So what I'm thinking is, right, on that indefinite article alone, I think like 4 knights sort of set off to kill the Archbishop of Canterbury. Yeah. So could you convict Henry on that?
Of incitement.
Yeah, of incitement. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I guess so. I mean, grammatically it's a question, so I'm not sure whether it would pass as an order.
So you'd have to give a wink as well, basically.
It would have to be a wink, wink. Don't write that down.
Yeah. So I mean, the reason I asked that is that kind of what forensic linguistics does. Is it something that on a very basic level examines language for for the detection of crime?
Yeah. So there's generally the field of forensic linguistics, which is still quite new. Sort of gone back a few decades, is split into 2 parts. So the first part, and some people disagree with this, but for the sake of argument we'll go ahead. On one of the sides of forensic linguistics, or one of the halves of forensic linguistics, is to do with language and the law and the legal process. So legal documents, the examination of witnesses, the police caution, police interviews, things like that are involved in the legal process, which of course language is integral to. They say it in the caution, anything you do say maybe.
So like the Miranda rights.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, in the States. So, and then the other half is the sort of stuff that you were just mentioning there about the language as evidence. So if there's any sort of criminal or civil case where language constitutes some of the evidence, then a forensic linguist could be enlisted to help the police or the legal teams or a private client with writing a report about various things. So that could be anonymous documents. So which of our suspects is most likely to have written this document? Who is this on a recording? So
it's a type of detection. There's an element of detection.
There is an element of detection, and some of the most high-profile cases are cases of detection. Yeah. So there's murder cases, for instance, where normally a husband, or not always, is suspected of murdering his wife, let's say, and has sent text messages from her phone, and the police have reason to suspect that those text messages aren't written by her, and then the police will often ask a forensic linguist to give an opinion on that.
So a forensic linguist can basically establish provenance of a particular voice, a particular identity of a person?
They can. Normally, they will be more measured in their response or opinion than saying this is definitely this person, this is definitely not this person.
Yeah.
It's normally a sort of scale of consistency or distinctiveness, whether that's written style or things like voice quality, pronunciation, distinctive elements of those type of things. So normally, a report would be measured in that way rather than a binary, yes, this is your guy, or no, this isn't your guy.
Right. So maybe we should sort of back it up a bit.
Okay.
So, I mean, forensic linguistics, so let's focus on the second part of it. So you're a linguist, right? Yeah. So what is it? What sort of methodologies do you draw from them? Like, could we say that forensic linguistics is a science, for example?
Yeah, well, some would argue that, and especially if you are to give admissible evidence in court, you would have to, ensure or at least convince the judge or whoever is presiding over a particular case that your evidence was scientific enough and reliable enough and accurate enough to be, for instance, put in front of a jury. But yeah, linguistics more generally, some of it is sort of definitely scientific, experimental linguistics, psycholinguistics, cognitive linguistics, areas like that. other elements of linguistics, like discourse analysis, which is what I do primarily, is less easy to convince people that it's a science. So you have to, especially in a forensic context, be very clear and systematic on the methodologies that you've used so that they're applicable and transparent.
Okay, so when you said discourse analysis, what do you mean by that? I guess then is the question, what is your specific version of forensic linguistics? Yeah,
so basically my definition of discourse analysis would be the analysis of any language in use, whether that's written or spoken.
Speech acts, as a philosopher might say.
Yeah, that's speech acts certainly is a big part of discourse analysis.
I'd imagine.
And early doors pragmatics. But forensic linguistics generally is the application of other fields of linguistics, like sociolinguistics or language variation, language and identity, corpus linguistics, which is the analysis of large bodies of text to identify patterns in language use. Critical discourse analysis, which is the identification or the addressing of social inequalities or dominance or power in discourse. Pragmatics, semantics, whatever you like, any sort of fundamental elements of linguistics applied in a forensic context. And one of those is discourse analysis. So discourse analysis can stretch from, for instance, conversation analysts in a forensic context could analyze the turn taken, the responses, the question types of police interviews in an interrogation, for instance. Similarly applied to similar conversation analysis could be applied to a cross-examination of a vulnerable witness, let's say, or a witness who is allegedly a victim of sexual assault or rape or anything. Or it could be the analysis of a police statement to identify whether or not the witness in question is responsible for authoring that statement, or whether it's been dictated to them, or whether it's been forced out of them by someone else.
It's been known to happen that.
Well, one of the, Malcolm Coulthard, one of the,
your co-author,
on the textbook, the sort of landmark forensic linguistic case, one of the ones that kicked everything off.
Oh, that's a good idea. We could talk about an example of a case.
Is the Derek Bentley statement.
So remind me.
So Derek Bentley and a friend of his were arrested. I think Derek Bentley was a teenager at the time, but he had learning difficulties, and they were found on top of a roof by police, and they'd been chased up there by the police, and they were on top of the roof, and various things happened, and his friend ended up shooting a police officer, and they were both arrested and charged for murder. And the only bit of evidence really, at the time that the police officer was shot, Derek Bentley's hands were tied behind his back. Arrested, he was under arrest, he'd been arrested, and the evidence that was used to convict Derek Bentley for a crime for which he was eventually hanged was his witness statement that he gave to the police, or allegedly gave to the police when he was arrested. And
he was erroneously charged.
Yeah, it turns out that sort of decades later, under Malcolm's analysis, it found that the language in the police statement was more typical of the register of the police than it would be of a guy who was, for all intents and purposes, illiterate.
So the allegation is that it was stitched up?
In a nutshell, yeah. And he was posthumously pardoned.
Okay, must be very pleased with that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, after sort of decades of campaigning by his family, that was the linguistic evidence, and that was a sort of watershed moment for forensic linguistics.
Right. So maybe we can say then, what is it? What did the forensic linguist analysis do specifically to attribute authorship to? To the police rather than Mr. Bentley.
Yeah, so it was. There was various things that he did, that Malcolm did in his analysis, but the one of the biggest ones, essentially, in any authorship case, you would get the disputed document, which in this case was the statement, and you'd compare it against whatever reference set you liked. And what Malcolm did was he compared it against other witness statements written by witnesses, some of which were part of that case, some of which were part of others. And also the writing of the police. And one of the key bits of the analysis was a tiny sort of smoking gun was the word then.
Okay.
And the order, the grammatical order in which then was used, and Malcolm found that the use of the word then in terms of its frequency and the constructions in which it was found was more typical of the register found in the police written reports than other witnesses.
And that meant we could say then definitively as well, that it was a member of the local constabulary rather than...
I think we would probably say that it was more consistent with being written by the police rather than Derek Bentley.
So, that type of work, it must be painstaking, it must be very, very detailed, you must need a real attention to minutiae.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's where the devil's in the detail. And, especially in cases where, because everyone always asks with authorship questions, students ask, people ask at conferences, couldn't someone just disguise their style?
That's a good question, that, yeah.
And, they can, and, there is a good amount of work, especially at the moment being done about imitation and imitating other people's language styles, especially in Undercover Policing by Nicky McLeod and Tim Grant. But the idea is that some elements of people's language choice will be under conscious control, and they'll be the bits that they'll be able to swap out and say, well, I'll move a little bit closer to someone else and away from myself. But then there will be other elements which are not under their conscious control. The ideal in authorship analysis will be able to identify those.
Wow, that's hard.
It is. Yeah. Well, it depends on the case. So there might be... I should say that authorship analysis is not just a forensic problem. Forensic authorship analysis is a forensic problem, but authorship analysis generally, for instance, of literary works or whatever, it can be a computational linguist problem.
So you could establish the provenance of a Shakespearean text.
Yeah, loads of stuff like that. Called stylometry, which is the statistical measurement of style, where they have hundreds of thousands of words of data to run machine learning algorithms on to identify, normally on the basis of the frequency of different linguistic features. And it becomes a text classification problem. And
you can separate, or you can disentangle conscious authorship from unconscious authorship.
Well, sometimes you can. There's an idea that function words, so the little words of grammar, so prepositions, determiners, the little grammar words rather than nouns and verbs and things like that, are less likely to be under the conscious control because they're part of the fabric of the way in which we speak and write. But I would argue that those little grammar words are just symptomatic of other linguistic choices rather than being distinctive in and of themselves.
That's fascinating, isn't it? So would you go as far as then saying, is it like that you can have an individual can have a linguistic fingerprint?
That is always an analogy that's drawn.
Is it a good one?
It's normally one that forensic linguists would shirk away from because...
Two different disciplines, I guess.
Well, mainly because, and this is mainly where my research is in this area, but mainly because if I had your fingerprint, I have all of the information I need. Or if I have a bit of your DNA, I have all the information that I need because that's unique to you. But if we have a sample of writing, it might have distinctive elements of your writing style, but you might share those elements of writing style with someone else. We just don't know. Whereas with DNA and fingerprints, we do know that they're unique.
So there's a little bit more legwork to do beyond.
There is a little bit more legwork, and also there's a theory in linguistics called idiolect, which is that every person has their own distinctive, unique version of their language. That's an accepted theory by and large, but it's an impossible one to prove because we don't have the data sets to compare every single person with every other person.
It's empirically impossible to...
It seems perfectly possible, but in a forensic context, if you have to prove that, then it's difficult. So that's why we would know... I mean, the forensic linguistic fingerprint is one that has some currency, I think, in terms of that idiolect theory, but in practical terms, we would never say that this is a unique piece of language written by only one person.
Yeah. So and as well, when you say idiolect, you mean something broader than, say, something like accent, I guess.
Oh, sure. Idiolect would be the whole lot. It would be your whole linguistic repertoire, everything. And early conceptions of idiolect is not just anything that you have said, but anything that you could say. So it's not just the language that you've used, but it's also the language that you have the ability or competence to use, which is immeasurable. So yeah, idiolect would encapsulate every single possible linguistic choice you could make, conscious or not.
Okay. Now, I was wondering, is there any other particular cases that you could mention? Because it's a good way, I think, to make apparent the discipline that is forensic linguistics.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of we've spoken a bit about authorship, so we can do a little bit of. I can talk a little bit about more recorded data, spoken data. A case that is often sort of cited in this way is the Yorkshire Ripper hoax.
Remind me.
Yeah, so there was obviously the Yorkshire Ripper was doing his thing in the 70s, and the police at the time who were working on the case, and this was a time before forensic linguistics in quotation marks was a field. The police received a recording and a series of letters purporting to be from the Yorkshire Ripper, and the police at the time, obviously West Yorkshire Police, sent the recording to Stanley Ellis, who was a dialectologist at Leeds University, to say, what can you tell us about this person? Which is easier to do with speech than it is with writing.
In order to
narrow
see
down
if you
the
can,
suspects.
Right, and see, can we sort of compare it to the person who was the Yorkshire Ripper? Is that right?
Well, they didn't know who the Yorkshire Ripper was.
Right. So they didn't have any.
They didn't have any lead, any clue that they could get would help narrow down the possible pool of suspects in an investigative way to aid the investigation. And Stanley Ellis, remarkably, sort of pinpointed 2 villages near Sunderland that this guy could have been from, but suspected that he hadn't lived there.
The hoaxer
hadn't lived there his entire life. At the time, they didn't know it was a hoax.
How did he do this?
Well, from the northeast, some of your vowels are giveaways.
And you are from the northeast.
I am from the northeast, a little bit further north than Sunderland, but yeah, on the basis of his predominantly vowel features, he identified 2 villages that he could have been from, and as time went on, there was questions raised as to whether.
And they were near each other, these villages?
Oh, within half a mile of each other, and over time there was questions raised as to whether this was real, whether this was a hoax, and Stanley Ellis warned against the police only investigating people who had an accent that sounded like the guy on the recording. Anyway, eventually Peter Sutcliffe was arrested and convicted and charged, but he obviously didn't have a Sunderland accent, anything like the hoaxer, so suddenly you have a hoax case.
Like a Yorkshire accent.
Yeah, exactly. Suddenly you have a hoax case, and it was sort of reopened, and oddly enough, and
the police had the information from the linguistic specialist.
Yeah, they had that information, and I don't know to what extent they acted on it. I don't know to extent they sort of searched around Yorkshire for people who had a Sunderland accent. But
well, it would make you stick out a little bit.
It would a bit, yeah, just a tad. But eventually, the DNA evidence was used on the envelopes that the guy had used to send the letters and the recordings. This guy was identified as John Humble. He was brought in, and he was from sort of a stone's throw away from the 2 villages where
remarkable. He must feel very vindicated.
Yeah. And this guy was obviously arrested for the hoax, and the rest is history. But that's a big sort of what we would call speaker profiling case, where you have a recording and the forensic phoneticians or the forensic speech scientists are asked, what can you tell us about this person?
So, I mean, what's interesting to me about that, I think, is that when I said, like, the police didn't act on the information they had, but
I'm not sure to what extent they did.
Yeah, so, I mean, and it's probably understandable, because it's cases like this that gave the discipline of forensic linguistics more respectability, more legitimacy. Sure. Is that right?
Yeah. And it's like anything. If there's precedent, if there's cases that a judge or legal counsel could point to and say this methodology was used, or a similar methodology was used in case A, B, or C with this effect, then obviously that's going to be better. But I should say that in normal cases, if there is forensic linguistic evidence, it will be part of a much bigger evidential picture. It's unlikely, if not impossible, that the forensic linguistic evidence will be the stuff that gets your guy.
Yeah, so the police, detectives, investigators, forensic linguistics, you're saying, will be a small component of a much bigger, richer picture.
Hopefully, yeah.
Which includes fingerprinting, DNA, all of these things. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be part of a bigger sort of patchwork of evidence, ideally.
Yeah, so the other case, I mean, it's the Netflix case, let's call it. Yeah, I know we want to talk about this, but it's because the reason I bring it up is because there is a Netflix series at the moment on the Unabomber, I guess American terrorist. I mean, there's not a really way to describe it, but it's kind of sort of sexy forensic linguistics at the moment due to this sort of series, which is great. Like, I mean, I don't know if you remember, David, like when Cracker was out, like, yeah, like loads of people started doing criminology and things like that at university. So the future is safe for you, David.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Now, the thing is, though, I mean, that case is really interesting because that's, I guess, I mean, one of the most high-profile instances of forensic linguistics being used successfly. So maybe I know you're familiar with that case. I know you're familiar with the guy who was doing it. Okay, what was his name again?
Jim Fitzgerald.
Jim Fitzgerald, precisely. Yeah, and he was. I mean, what was unique about how forensic linguistics was used to detect the Unabomber? Because I mean, the Unabomber is such of a campaign. It's one for over many years, and it was. I mean, I think forensic linguistics was the key to his detection. Yeah,
I mean that's the Unabomber documentary on Netflix has got a lot of like you say, attention to forensic linguistics. Tons of people asking me, "Oh yeah, you heard what's the Unabomber documentary?" I must admit I've not seen it, but
the busman's holiday for you, basically.
Yeah. But I do know obviously of the case, and I've met Jim Fitzgerald at my first ever forensic linguistics conference, and yeah, the linguistic evidence was good, and in terms of catching the Unabomber. And what was important in that case was that the evidence that was used and the analysis that was used actually interlinked quite a lot with the linguistic theory of idiolect. So, as I understand it, once the FBI and had done their linguistic analysis and identified some commonalities between the manuscript, the manifesto,
the Unabomber manifesto,
and some stuff that he'd written before that. They identified some commonalities in that, and the defence, as far as I'm aware, hired a fairly high-profile linguist to say that the commonalities meant nothing because anyone could write anything at any time. But what became clear was that while that's true, the more time, the more individual elements you add together in terms of co-selecting things, the co-occurrence of these features in the same text is more evidence that it's written by the same person. So while it's true, really, that anyone can write anything at any time, the more things that you find in common in a particular text, the less likely that is to have been written by two different people.
He had Fitzgerald had he had a sort of a bit of an uphill battle of convincing, the police that of the legitimacy of his efforts.
Okay, yeah, is that what's in the documentary?
Is that not true? No,
I don't know.
That seems to be the impression. Yeah.
Right, I don't know. I mean, I know of it obviously from forensic linguistics literature. I do know that there's because essentially what they did was use the web as a sort of reference set to see if you put all of these individual word choices basically into I guess it was an early iteration of Google or some search engine, and what texts come up, which of course was a fraction of the size that Google is now, or the internet, then the only texts that were coming up were online versions of this manifesto, which give credence to the fact that the only place where these words were found together was in the manifesto, which was evidence that he wrote it.
And it narrowed basically the field of suspects in, I guess.
For sure, yeah.
Which allowed police to narrow their
their
search.
If you have one text where there's a sort of distinctive looking or significant set of linguistic co-selections, language choices that are made together, and then you find those same set of choices in another text, and no others insofar as that the web-based methodology, then that's really strong evidence.
Really strong evidence.
But as always, it would depend on which texts were available in that set that you were referencing it against. And there is a book written by a colleague in Manchester Metropolitan University called Sam Larner, and he's written a sort of book, I think it's based on one of his degrees, that sort of problematizes that Weber's reference set method. But yeah, the Unabomber, it's sort of got a lot of attention on forensic linguistics, and some of it's good, some of it's not so good. So while I'm certainly of the camp where the more people we can get through the door to teach forensic linguistics to, the better. But at the same time, I think it may raise expectations as to what forensic linguists can do. Not every case is the Unabomber.
So it's not as romantic and exciting as that now.
Some of it, I'm sure some of my students would attest that it's not. But those are the spicy cases that get people into it.
Notoriety.
And I'm all for that. And if I don't know about the legitimacy of the documentary, but yeah, it got people talking, and it got people interested in forensic linguistics, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing.
Now, another thing that you work on is authorship attribution.
Yeah.
And could you tell me then about the Jenny Nicol case?
I can tell you about the Jenny Nicol case. So that was another case on which Malcolm was the expert witness, Malcolm Coulthard.
So just so everybody can know, this is Malcolm Coulthard is your co-author with Alison Johnson, and that's your book, which is an introduction to forensic linguistics, language and evidence. That's kind of sort of a benchmark text for teaching undergrads about. Yeah,
it's one of a handful of textbooks on forensic linguistics. It's actually the textbook that I learned. The first edition was a textbook that I used when I was in undergrad with Alison at Leeds, and after my PhD Viva, Malcolm was my external examiner, Alison was my supervisor, and they asked me if I would be an author on the second edition, and I was delighted with that. So yeah, and actually there's a section on the Authorship Attribution chapter which I wrote about Jenny Nicol. Jenny Nicol, it was a murder case, and it was the type of case that I mentioned to you at the start about Jenny Nicol went missing, and there were a series of text messages sent from her phone saying, various things, but basically, I'm still alive, I've run away, blah, blah, blah. And the police had reason to suspect that they weren't written by her, but they were in fact written by her lover at the time, David Hodgson. And Malcolm was given a series of text messages, as is ideal in this kind of case, a set of text messages that were known to have been written by Jenny, over which there was no dispute, and a set of text messages that were known to be written by David Hodgson, over which there were no disputes, and then the disputed text messages that the police had reason to believe were written by someone other than Jenny.
Well, that's interesting in and of itself, because things like text messaging, social media messaging, that brings a whole new sort of forensic linguistics is now branching out into sort of
for sure
technology and the internet and so on.
There's way more ways to write to people now than there used to be,
Right.
And so yeah, there's a lot of the cases these days are electronic in nature. There's
So your colleague Malcolm Coulthard was looking at these text messages, comparing definitive text messages attributed to Jenny Nicol and the ones that were claimed to be Jenny Nicol. Now, that's the $1 question. How did he separate one from the other?
Yeah, so, well, in terms of the text messages that he was given by the police, there was no dispute over who'd written those, but his job was to offer an opinion as to which of the two candidate writers, Jenny or Hodgson, were most likely to have written the text messages in question, and he identified a number of features. There were overall, I think there were 9 features, again, which were co-selections. They didn't happen on their own, but they were in the same texts. Some of them were to do with things like spacing in between letters, spacing in between words.
All right. So does somebody have two spaces after a full stop?
One of them was so, for instance, the number 2 instead of the word to. For instance, I think an example was I've gone to Keswick or something like that.
Right.
And one of the authors had a space between to and Keswick, and the other didn't. Whenever they used the number 2 instead of the word to, one of them had a space after it and the other didn't, consistently in their known text messages. And it was, I think, 9 features which Malcolm found to be in the disputed texts to be more consistent with being written by David Hodgson than Jenny Nicol.
And that was the beginning of how you could discriminate them, yeah.
Yeah, and that was it. And Malcolm, in that case, if I remember rightly, was given the unique opportunity, as far as I'm aware, of presenting to the jury the evidence in form of a PowerPoint presentation, rather than the normal cross-examination question and answer.
Was this an innovation?
As far as I'm aware, I certainly am of the understanding that it's not common. But normally, expert witnesses, from what I hear, leave very unsatisfied with the evidence that they were able to give because the barristers controlled all of the questions and therefore all of their answers. But in this case, Malcolm was able to show the jury a PowerPoint presentation
where he presented an objective case for attribution.
He had the text messages from Jenny, the text messages from David, and he had the disputed text, and you could just highlight the features that were common to David's style and different to Jenny's. And eventually, David was convicted of murder. And what was really important for forensic linguistics in that case, which speak to what you were saying earlier about the more cases this is used in, the better, is that the decision was appealed by David Nicol on the basis that the forensic linguistic evidence was unreliable, and that appeal was squashed on the basis that the forensic linguistic evidence was reliable, which was great because it was directly being challenged, isolated as being challenged in terms of its reliability, and it stood the appeal.
Stood the test, basically.
Exactly, yeah. Which is great.
Yeah. Now, another thing that you alluded to it there is that is it the case that I guess sort of the courts, the criminal justice system, are using forensic linguistics as expert witnesses? I mean, I presume that is the case, but is it something that's contested, or is it? I mean, sorry, I don't mean to sort of dispute the legitimacy of discipline all the time, but are people using forensic linguistics in court to establish provenance and attribution like this a lot more?
For sure, yeah. There, in authorship cases, not just authorship cases, but people are using forensic linguistics, and often actually what happens is the experts offer to or asked to write a report, which will be part of the evidence, but less frequently are they asked to then therefore appear in court and be cross-examined. So normally the evidence is just their report. But yeah, people are using forensic linguistics for sure. And in some cases in forensic linguists at least does, and I must say that I've never been an expert witness in a case, nor do I particularly have the appetite to do that at this stage. But if the defence find out that, or vice versa, find out that one side's using a forensic linguist, then they're often going to enlist one themselves to try and
muddy the waters, or maybe that's unfair, but
to try and find out whether they could rebut anything that was written in the report from the other side. And actually what you find is that because there's a handful of forensic linguists in the country, they often know each other. And what would be a great movement actually would be to get the two experts to talk before the trial or before they stand and say, look, what can we agree on, and what are the points for dispute between these different reports. But actually the spoken recording, so forensic speech science, which analyzes the voice on sort of disputed recordings rather than the written things, which is authorship analysis, is far more commonly used in court, far more commonly part of a trial.
Yeah, and as you say yourself, it doesn't necessarily have to be the really glamorous cases. It could be just like a plagiarism case or something like that. Could it be? Or... Yeah,
I mean, obviously that wouldn't be a criminal necessarily.
Of course,
yeah. There are various different cases that you hear, and not all of them are high-profile cases. Unfortunately, some of them are very serious cases. But yes, they're not all murders, they're not all kidnaps. There might be, it might just be on a recording, a forensic speech scientist might just be, or a forensic linguist might just be asked to say, we've got this recording. Which of the people who were recorded do you think said this bit, this line in the transcript, this part of the recording, because it may be evidential? And the forensic linguist might just be asked to say, right, well, which one was it? That may not necessarily be a murder case, and also any decent forensic linguist, if they have a look at the evidence and there's either not enough or that they have concerns about it, would say, I don't know. You absolutely have to be able to say, I don't know, especially in this country where your duty is to the court rather than the side who's paying you. you have to be able to say I don't know, because an informed I don't know is better than a guess yes or a guess no. That would have potentially catastrophic.
Well, then you're just making stuff up.
Yeah, and that would set the field back sort of no end. So yeah.
Is there any cases where they've got it wrong, forensic linguists? Is there any sort of notable cases? Because that would be a good way of, I think, disentangling good forensic linguistics from bad linguistics. Forensic linguistics, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I don't think so. There will be, of course, cases where the forensic linguistic evidence has not been admitted by the judge.
Right, so you can have admissible evidence or inadmissible evidence.
You'd hope that if the forensic linguistic evidence was poor, or the analysis was poor, that it would not be put in front of a jury, at which point you wouldn't know whether the evidence was good or bad because it hasn't been part of the trial. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any necessarily bad forensic linguistics. I mean, there are, this is part of the problem with things like this Unabomber documentary, where, you do get sort of well-intentioned amateurs, basically,
right?
Wanting to have the two pennies worth, because it's the same as any language-related field or any linguistics-related field. Everyone speaks language, so you think therefore you're an
automatic expert. Yeah.
Whereas they
haven't put the hours in the discipline.
They don't have the pedigree. They don't have the experience. They don't have the expertise. So I'm absolutely sure, if not in this country, then on the continent or in the States, there will absolutely be people who should not be given forensic linguistic evidence, but are. But for rightly or wrongly, I don't know who they are.
Yeah. What would it be for you then? Just a general question. What would it be for you that sort of counts as that would be admissible evidence? What would be the essential conditions?
I think the first thing would be that there would have to be enough in terms of quantity and quality of data for an analysis to be performed. I would raise eyebrows if there were a tiny amount of data and conclusive opinions were offered. There was a little bit of controversy in the field when I just joined it, sort of the mid-2000s, about a Facebook case in which a forensic linguist who is in many areas very well respected in authorship analysis produced a report that was discredited and criticised by other forensic linguists.
He had a bad day?
I'm not sure what influence that's had on his reputation nor his livelihood, but some of the work that he's done has been pivotal in authorship analysis and forensic stylistics in particular. So I think the point that I was raising there was that at the moment there are no explicit standards. So one person's rigorous analysis might be another person's garbage. But hopefully, as time goes on, we can reach agreements about standards, and I know that there is movements doing towards that.
What would be your recommendations?
There are people who are being paid far more than me to make those decisions, but my recommendation would be that there would have to be enough data, and it would have to be good quality.
Yeah, as you said.
There would have to be the linguistic features on the basis of which comparisons were being made. In an authorship case, let's say, the linguistic features that were being used were frequent enough, were basically, my biggest concern would be that you can clearly evidence linguistic consistency in a person and linguistic distinctiveness between that person and others. And that's primarily from sort of Tim Grant's work on another text message case of linguistic consistency and linguistic distinctiveness, rather than ideas of the linguistic fingerprint where this is definitely that person. It's going to be on a scale of consistency and distinctiveness, and in order to achieve those measurements of consistency and distinctiveness you need enough data. I would also want people to be really clear on the methods that they've used, why they've chosen the linguistic features that they've chosen, why would those features discriminate one author from not only other authors in the case or potential authors in the case, but anyone. And this is an area where there's tons of work being done. And because on the one hand, to go back to the sort of the stylometric computationalists who do work on things like Shakespeare, who have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words of data can identify with 99% accuracy who wrote what, or which text belongs to which author. But in a forensic case, you have far less data than that. So you have these two sets of people.
Runs against one of your essential criteria.
Yeah,
you need a lot of data.
Yeah, for sure. You have these two sets of people who are computationalists who can do really, really rigorous, mainly machine learning techniques and identify authors and texts really accurately, and linguists who have the skills to do that on much smaller data sets, but those two people aren't talking to each other. So one thing that I would really like to see, and I'm not alone in this, is for forensic linguists and computational linguists, or even data scientists or whatever, to have conversations about how to come to robust, scientific, in scare quotes, reliable methods.
Okay. Now, one of the other things that you focus on is forensic phonetics. Yeah. Now, I don't even know what that means, David. So you're basically talking to an idiot here,
right?
Yeah. So could you maybe explain what forensic phonetics is and what consequences it has for analysing the human voice?
Okay. Yeah. Well, forensic speech science is what they often refer. The group themselves refer. I mean, the chapter that I wrote in the textbook is called Forensic Phonetics. But so
speaker profiling, is that right?
Speaker profiling, speaker comparison. For instance, the Yorkshire Ripper hoax would be a case for a forensic phonetician / forensic speech science, which is ironically a bit of a mouthful. But yeah, so that would be sort of speaker comparison is the sister discipline of authorship analysis or authorship attribution. The difference being that the evidence is recorded rather than written down. And yeah, they deal with a whole range of things from, identifying voices on recordings, comparing recordings to see if the speaker in one recording is the same as the speaker in another recording, forensic speaker profiling. So what can you tell us about this person on the basis of their voice, where they're from, how old are they, things like that, which some elements of a person's personality or character are easier, or biological makeup are easier to identify than others. For instance, there's some people who say you can identify how big someone is on the basis of the human voice that you find on the recording, whereas other people say you can't. But things like age, gender is obviously much easier because biologically women tend to have higher pitched voices within a certain range, usually, yeah. But yeah, so they deal with a whole range of problems that are to do with any evidence that's recorded. And to answer your question about the human voice, which is one of the reasons why forensic phoneticians are often the envy of authorship analysts, is that a 20-second recording contains tons of information about a person's voice, because 20
seconds, that's all you need, yeah?
Well, it depends. Again, if I'm sure forensic phoneticians would tell me it would depend on the quality of the recording and what was said and things like that, but and the quality of the evidence and the quality of the data. But yeah, I mean, if you have a really distinctive voice but a really short recording of that voice, would be potentially better data, or at least more analysable data, than a 2-hour recording of someone who didn't have a very distinctive voice. But I'm sure there are maybe forensic phoneticians who would take issue with that. But yeah, so there's any number of things that people can use as measures as a forensic speech science. It can be things like your vowel and consonant pronunciations, which, as phonetic experts, which they are trained as, they can identify, distinctive vowel formations, consonant pronunciations, and things like that. And at the same time, there's things that you can measure acoustically, like pitch of voice, rate of speech, things like that.
Can I ask a naive question?
Yeah.
Can forensic linguistics examine the use of silence, how people use silence?
Interesting. They can. So I guess, hypothetically, there may be a recording that's disputed. And one of the features in that recording might be untypically long pauses, for instance, which never say never. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater would be, obviously there's less literature on that sort of thing, as far as I'm aware, than there is on other features of voice. But yeah, I mean, why not? It would have to be in combination with something else. It couldn't just be an hour recording of nothing. But yeah, another area where silence is dead interesting, which isn't related to authorship analysis or forensic speech science, is silence in police interviews.
Oh, that is interesting.
And the not necessarily just silence, but perhaps even no comment interviews in a jurisdiction where you're innocent until you're proven guilty, and you have the right to not say anything in order to not
you have the right to remain silent with the Miranda rights.
But in practice, if there's a police interview where all of the questions are met with no comment or a silence, as a juror, what indication might you take, or what imaginative leaps might you take about that person on the basis of an interview where they didn't say anything? So that's one area where, I know that's not what you were getting at, but one area where the lack of utterance, if you like, could be dead interesting.
It would kind of, I guess, go against the grain of what a linguist is about, isn't it? It's about voice and noise and language and speech and all of these things.
Yeah, I suppose so. And again, it might be, the length of pause, for instance, or the shortness of pause even might be,
or the lack of pause. Maybe.
Yeah, it might be, so untypical in a given population that it suddenly becomes something that a forensic phonetician needs to take note of if they're trying to get a profile of a speaker or trying to compare speakers.
One of the other things you've done research in, David, is you had a Leverhulme grant, and you were looking at the incitement of violence against women on online discussion forums. So I was wondering, could you speak to that a little bit? Yeah,
so that was a British Academy Leverhulme funded project, which is ongoing actually, and sort of serendipitously, I was reading a book on holiday. I was supposed to be on holiday, but I was reading a book called The Cyber Effect, and it was the chapters that I got through. It was a good book. The chapters that I got through were sort of making the link between people's online behaviour and offline behaviour. In fact, the context that was given was 50 Shades of Grey, and how that those sort of ideologies and practices might influence people's offline behaviour for better or for worse. And I had an idea about a particular community online in the manosphere, if you like, of this sort of
the manosphere.
Yeah, this sort of
some men's rights activists.
That sort of thing. But perfectly sort of on the clear web, not sort of in the dark web or anything like that. Perfectly sort of Googleable, and things like that, about just discussion forums where people were talking about picking up women. Because there's a big community called the Pickup Artist community, which pride themselves on sharing advice and things about. I mean, I'm not an expert in the Pickup Artist community by any means.
So it's kind of like a forum on how to pull.
Yeah, and there are lots of them, and yeah, basically, and a lot of those conversations are fine. Some of them are misogynistic. Some of the ideologies underlying the idea that you can go through a certain script and routine and bet a woman is probably misogynistic.
Is it what you were trying to find was what you were focusing on? I guess, or zoning in on, was the incitement of violence against women.
Yeah, to see whether it was there, because I didn't know whether it was. And I guess what part of the problem is what constitutes incitement. So your sort of first example from Shakespeare.
Right,
would be something that I would sort of need to get an expert's opinion on. But what I was interested in looking for was places where these group members were sort of given advice, support, or field reports where they write on these forums about their experiences with women and how successful they were by doing X, Y, and Z.
So they could have just been lying.
They could have been, for sure. I mean, and my job was never to sort of say, oh, this person's committed a crime. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the discourses that swirl around in these places, with the idea that might then affect someone's offline behaviour if they were susceptible to those sort of ideologies.
What did you find?
I found some really interesting intersections between ideas of consent and resistance that these people were discussing. So one of the the big findings in forensic linguistic discourse analysis in terms of courtroom examination is the ideological questioning of people who are alleged to be rape victims, and how the defence barristers or attorneys sort of shape or reshape the alleged victims' narratives in order for it to make it look like they gave consent. And that often draws on rape myths and tropes like, you were drunk, what were you wearing, you were nice to him earlier in the day, all of that sort of stuff, which is regularly drawn upon by cross-examining barristers who are, for all intents and purposes, and I'm sure they would argue, doing their job for their client, those narratives are transformed into narratives of consent, and if it's consensual, then there was no crime committed.
So this is being say the tropes that you're talking about, which are being replicated by barristers who sort of defend, say, for example, men against allegations of sexual violence. Yeah. This is being replicated in these forums.
Well, what I've actually found is, and what Susan Ehrlich, who writes about fantastically about that sort of courtroom discourse, an ideological question of women, is that women have to display or demonstrate that they put up the utmost resistance. Now, what that constitutes...
That could be anything from saying no to getting a machine gun.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's the ideology that women are up against, is that they have to prove utmost resistance in order for it to have definitely not been consensual and therefore definitely been sexual assault. What I found in this data, which is not yet published, is that women are actually up against ideologies of utmost perseverance by blokes.
Could you explain
Sure.
that?
So that in the forums that I've been looking at, we have clear examples where men talk about experiencing resistance from women and what they've done to get around that. Some of them are as brazen as, I just pushed through and did it anyway. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but that's the idea. And others dismiss the resistance of women, or at least insofar as they report them online, dismiss the resistance that they experience from women as either being what they call an anti-slut defence, so women feel like they have to put up a barrier so that they don't feel so badly about themselves when they eventually, inevitably give it up to the bloke. They dismiss it as being non-important resistance and a challenge to overcome, and those are the metaphors and the discourses that emerge, is that it's almost like a combat situation. It's almost like a battlefield whereby resistance is something to be broken down or overcome or breached, and
rather than agreement.
Oh, for sure. And if you get through it, then it's a success.
So I wonder, I mean, that's really interesting, right? I mean, is there any chance you could apply this to some of the language in sort of trials about sexual violence trials or rape trials? I mean, where there's if these myths and these tropes are coming up again and again and again, surely that would be a place for forensic linguistics to apply their tools and their methodology to what sort of for prosecutors and defenders are doing.
I think the work that's been done in discourse analysis on that area about relying on damaging ideological assumptions and rape myths in the cross-examination of rape victims it has been established to the extent where it's often reported that the experience of cross-examination is re-victimizing the victims. It's reliving it. It's I wouldn't go as far as to say it's almost as bad as the initial offence, but it's a horrendous experience, and that's well established now that happens. And there are various things that are trying to be put in place, various special measures that are trying to be put in place to protect vulnerable witnesses from that sort of thing. So, for instance, the recent government policy to cross-examine, or for the cross-examination to be conducted via recorded and then presented in court, rather than having the alleged rape victim stand in court and be grilled. But I guess the resistance that they'll always come up against is that the barristers are just doing their jobs. They have to prove that and they might be that their client is innocent.
Yeah, that is the justice system. Like that they have to. Well, they will argue, I guess, that people are entitled to a fair trial and should have a defence.
To the extent, that the fact that you'd had a drink was the fact that you gave consent is obviously ridiculous. But I don't know, and there are people who are doing work in this area far more than I am, who would have better recommendations and the better ways forward. But I hope that, and not just these cases, but I hope that we move towards a fairer cross-examination process generally. But yeah, the resistance is always going to be between someone who says, look, this is unfair, and someone who says, I'm just doing my job.
Now, I guess I have one last question to ask you. I mean, it's sort of I think of it from a philosophical perspective. I mean, the classical exposition of what language is in Aristotle, where he says zoon, logon, ekon. Which sounds a lot better in the Greek than in English. But what it means is the human being is the animal that speaks. That's what distinguishes us. Yeah. Well, so I wonder, what is it about the voice that fascinates you? What is it? What do you love about this? What do you think about it all the time? Yeah,
I like it that, well, from a practical perspective, and I wouldn't put this on the top of my list as to why I like doing linguistics, but the data is easy to come by because there's lots of it from everywhere. I like that it's integral to everything that we do. I like it that, in fact, oddly enough, forensic linguistics was the reason that I chose to do A-level English language and then a degree in English language at university. At that time, it was an English language branded degree. I didn't know what linguistics was until I walked through the door. And I really wanted to, when I was first doing English language as a degree level, I wanted to study how I could use language in ways how I could become an expert in communication, I guess is what I wanted, and how I could use language to get what I wanted, and how I could analyse other people's language to see if they were trying to get one over on me, and so things like that. And forensic linguistics was something that I was interested in from day one, and it just so happened that the journey was that I became interested and obviously fully involved in that now. But I don't know, I like the idea of choice. I like the idea of how people change their language use in terms of the context that they're... I mean, almost instantly, we were using language in a very different way the second before you said you're recording now to what we are now,
Yeah,
I love that. I love that dynamism. I love the variability. And on the other hand, I also love the predictability and the patterns that emerge, and making new discoveries about something that is so common and so pervasive that you would think almost, what else can you know? You speak English, so why are you doing a degree in English language? I love the idea of choice. I love the idea of predictability and unpredictability, and I love that it's everywhere.
David Wright, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Cheers.
Come on, Jimmy. Who are you going to fight against when this balloon of yours goes up?
Thank you for listening to The Well. Our theme tune is Love the Government by El Papa Giraffe and is licensed under Creative Commons. You can follow us on iTunes or your preferred podcast app.